Hello and welcome to another episode of KARE 11 on the Record. I'm political reporter Danny Spiewak. This weekend we're getting a global view of events in Minneapolis and the state of Minnesota by talking with BBC U.S. Special Correspondent Katty Kay. She's going to be in Minneapolis in the fall on tour with her podcast partner Anthony Scaramucci, a former Trump communications director. Well, I'm very excited to introduce our guest for this weekend's KARE 11 on the Record, and that is Katty Kay, BBC U.S. Special Correspondent and host of The Rest is Politics U.S. podcast. Katty, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate the chance to talk
Danny, it's great to be with you. Thank you.
Yeah, so you host a podcast with former Trump communications director Anthony Scaramucci, and you're going to be on tour ahead of the midterms coming to Minneapolis in October. Tell us about the podcast, that relationship you have with Anthony, and how that really all started.
Yeah, we're super excited to be coming to Minneapolis on October the 11th. We decided that it was a great time just before the midterms to take our politics podcast on the road through America. I think we're going to like 7 or 8 cities, including Toronto in Canada. There's a huge amount of interest around the world in these elections, and also there's a huge amount of interest in the US. And we host a podcast that is somebody who's been an insider, who traveled on the 2016 campaign with Donald Trump, who worked famously, as he used to say, for 11 days, which is now a unit of time, a Scaramucci, in the White House before he was fired by President Trump, and has had a kind of inside and outside relationship with him. And I've been in Washington since 1996. Danny, I came for 3 years and ended up staying and have covered American elections since then. And we launched this podcast a couple of years ago thinking this would be a great combination of somebody who watches America from the outside, but is sort of also an insider, but who's a journalist, and somebody who's been inside politics in a Trump administration. And boy, have we had fascinating times, right, over the last couple of years. But we also have fun. It's also, I think people will find if they listen to the podcast, there's a lot of inside knowledge, there's a lot of analysis, but we also like to bring a little bit of humor and levity to it, because I think we all need a bit of ice cream with our spinach these days.
Yeah, for sure. When you come to Minneapolis, it'll be, less than a month from the midterms. Just tell us why it was significant that you chose Minnesota and Minneapolis specifically. Tell us why you decided to come here and what you think the main themes will be for your appearance here.
Well, I mean, who'd have thought that Minneapolis would be so much at the heart of American politics, right? Over the last few years, my first big political trip to Minneapolis was in 2008, and I came for the Republican National Convention when, of course, it was John McCain, and then Sarah Palin burst out of the gates onto the world with this kind of extraordinary political speech that she gave and seemed like a political virtuoso. So that was a kind of introduction to me politically to Minneapolis and St. Paul. But then since then, the world has watched, Danny, your city and your state, as we've had the killing of George Floyd, launching the Black Lives Matter movement. And then more recently, of course, the protests against ICE, which I was actually traveling in Europe at the time. Sometimes I feel like I'm a little bit of a therapist at the moment, going to Europeans and saying, it's okay, America is still there. You can, it's still your friend. And I can't tell you how much people were gripped by the ICE raids, of course, the killing of 2 American citizens, the bravery of the people of Minneapolis who stood up for their friends and neighbors and colleagues, and even for people they didn't know, and helped them out and risked their lives, literally, for people who were being targeted by ICE. And it got an enormous amount of attention around the world. And I would argue it changed the trajectory of the Trump presidency significantly, and potentially even we're going to see the ramifications of that in these very important midterm elections in November.
What do you think the global perspective was on what was happening in Minneapolis and Operation Metro Surge, particularly when it comes to the Trump administration's actions? I know I had heard from others outside the country that they couldn't believe what they were seeing was actually in the United States.
What you heard, Danny, is what I heard. And I think there's no sugarcoating this, that when that happened, there was not just shock, because people have got used to a radical Trump administration. There was also dismay that we were seeing an ally that has been an ally of the United States, of the Europeans so steadfastly since the Second World War behave in a way that people didn't recognize. I mean, this was really, for Europeans in particular, the sight of masked officials on the streets getting into fights with citizens, dragging people from their cars, using tear gas, the aggression of the tactics obviously reminded Europeans of authoritarian regimes that we have known in Europe as well. And I heard that comparison. I happened to be in Switzerland at the time, at the height of the protests. And I remember people saying, wow, we didn't ever think we would see this in the United States. And can America come back from this? And my answer to them is watch what the people of Minneapolis did, not just watch what ICE did and what the Trump administration has done to erode the concept of the firewall between the Justice Department and the White House, questions about the rule of law, the aggressive tactics of ICE, but watch importantly what the American citizens did, because in that moment, American citizens stood up for the things that were right and solid and democratic about this country. And I think that response from the people of Minneapolis was as important for the trajectory of this country as the actions of the ICE officers on the streets.
When you look at the impact of the midterms, within the Democratic Party in Minnesota, there's an interesting primary race in the U.S. Senate seat, a more progressive Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan, and then a kind of more centrist Congresswoman Angie Craig. And ICE has been like the huge issue in that. Where do you think the Democratic base is going with that? Or do you think they're going to want candidates in this election cycle that are a little bit stronger against the Trump administration?
One thing that the research is showing us about the Democrats at the moment is that they want a fighter. I think we're in a moment of American politics where the ability to fight is prized above many other things, and whether that is on the right with the actions of the Trump administration and the beliefs of many people in MAGA, or whether it is on the left, you're seeing it with the election of the mayor in New York, you're seeing it play out in the Michigan race, you're seeing it play out in Maine, you're seeing it play out in Minnesota as well, with candidates who show an ability to be robust and take the fight to people they feel are behaving egregiously. And I think that is going to play out. And I think that in a way that there is a sort of I think a civil war is too strong a term, but there is a tussle certainly going on in the Democratic Party at the moment between the establishment, which still feels that you have to field candidates in statewide and national elections who can appeal to the center of American politics and perhaps even peel away some disaffected Republicans, and those who say, no, the time has come for something much more radical, whether it's on finance, whether it's on immigration, whether it is on climate, whether it is on income distribution, a whole healthcare, a whole host of issues where we also need to have populist candidates who appeal to the base of the Democratic Party. You're seeing that, you've seen it play out in Texas, for example. So I think it's going to be this midterm election is going to be important because it's going to be the control of the House, it's going to be control of the Senate. But I also do think the election of individual people, like in Minnesota, is going to give us an indication of where the Democratic Party goes for 2028 and who they field for 2028 in the presidential election and what chances more progressive candidates have. Is this just a New York mayor phenomenon? Or is this a broader phenomenon from a disaffected group of people, particularly younger voters, who feel rents are too high, wages are not high enough, AI is taking their jobs, and who have a real sense of dissatisfaction about something fundamental in the country? And I think it's going to be super interesting to watch these midterms to see what it tells us about that mood in the country.
I know you and Anthony talk about this a lot in terms of, as you mentioned, kind of wooing the so-called working class bloc or even more rural voters. And we see that internally in Minnesota with the governor's race and everything like that. But that's obviously been one of the big criticisms and weaknesses of the Democratic Party. Do you feel that they've done a better job looking into 2026 than they did in 2024? Or do you think Republicans really still have a hold on that type of voter?
I think it's going to be interesting. You watch a race like Maine. My son lives in Maine, and so I've been watching that race pretty closely. And you have a candidate who is clearly making a point of appealing to working class voters and is managing to appeal particularly to working class men, because I think there are a lot of working class men who feel disaffected by politics at the moment, who feel they don't have a home necessarily in either party, and they like the robustness of a candidate like Graham Plattner, and they like specifically the economic message. And I do think it is a kind of populist economic message of income redistribution that you see from some of those candidates. It's Graham Plattner, and one of the things that the Democratic Party has been criticized for alienating working class voters has been on some of the social and cultural issues. Was it, did it talk too much about trans rights? Was it too focused on green initiatives around climate change? And a lot of people might think those are very valid policies, but the focus distracted them from the issues that working class voters are, particularly the economic issues that working class voters are more focused on, and maybe alienated a lot of working class, particularly working class men. So it's going to be interesting to see whether you have now candidates who have managed to reach out to those communities and say, listen, I am focused on your economic issues. I'm focused on your healthcare issues. And whilst I'm a Democrat and it's not an easy needle to thread. I'm a Democrat and I support the rights of minorities. Those are not the priority of this campaign and this particular moment. And you've seen Democratic candidates get kind of ensnared in that conundrum, if you like, in the last election campaign. And it's going to be interesting to see how they handle it this time around.
Looking ahead again to your visit in Minneapolis in October, you and Anthony obviously been doing this for a while on the podcast, and you got to know each other very well, I'm sure. What have you learned from him as somebody who was inside the Trump administration? What type of perspective have you gained just getting to know him in the way you know him?
Yeah, it's been super fun. Just between you and me and everyone else who's listening, we didn't even know each other when we started this podcast. I'd interviewed him a couple of times around politics. He'd interviewed me for one of the books that I'd written around women and leadership. And when I thought of launching the podcast, I was looking for somebody, I was looking for a co-host who saw America from a side that most foreigners don't. Honestly, I mean, they go to LA and they go to New York and that's all they see. And I wanted somebody who was a Republican and somebody who knew Donald Trump. And Anthony struck me and I texted him and said, would you be interested? It'll be an hour a week, I promised him. It's actually turning out to be like 20 hours a week. But he immediately said yes. And we've had so much fun getting to know each other. And he's so smart and he's so well read and he knows so much history. And he has this kind of psychological profile of Trump. And I think that's been fun for me to get. First of all, we have a lot of fun on the podcast. He's very funny and can drive me crazy and I can drive him crazy, but I think that's part of the humor of it. But he's also just got this sensibility for Trump that I think is super interesting. And what's been really interesting about the podcast, Danny, is I had thought that a podcast like this one that's about politics to succeed would have to be different for Americans compared to how it would be for foreigners. You could do one podcast for foreigners and you could do one podcast for Americans, but they wouldn't be the same. But now about 40% of our audience is in America. We have a very big audience in the UK. We're number one or two often in podcasts every week in the UK because foreigners are fascinated with what is happening in American politics. But it's now got a much bigger American audience than we had anticipated. And I'm so glad about that. I'm so glad that our different perspectives, an insider and outsider, and I think I can bring that sense of what the world is making of what's happening here. But it's a really fun combination. We have fun. I think anyone who comes to the show, please come, please join us. We'll take your questions. And we would love to meet you. But I think you'll find we have a lot of fun on stage.
Yeah, you're a really interesting combination together. And, I was particularly interested.
Yeah, who'd have thought a Long Islander and a posh Brit, right? I mean, who'd have thought that would work? But there you go.
Works, yeah, right. Yeah. And, you have the perspective, obviously, you grew up around the world and lived, of course, in the Middle East as a child. And you were the anchor for BBC's coverage of 2016 and 2020 elections. Since 2016, how do you think the global perspective on the United States has changed, with the rise of President Trump?
Yeah, I mean, I think let's go back to the polling on this, to the global polling. And it saddens me as somebody who lives here. I have 4 children who all have American and British passports, who loves America, to say that the polling all shows that global opinions of America have never been this low. America is not seen as a reliable ally. It has treated, under the second Trump administration in particular, allies poorly, whether it's around threatening to take Greenland, which was a huge moment for Europeans, whether it's around the tariff war, which has affected the entire world, and the idea of using trade as some kind of leverage in negotiations. So there is a lot of despair about America. And I think what has changed in the second Trump administration is that European allies in particular, who I've spoken to, and leaders who I have interviewed, have said to me, look, for America to elect Donald Trump once is one thing. When Joe Biden came into office in 2020 and said America is back, the world kind of breathed a sigh of relief and thought, great, we're going to go back to the status quo ante and things will be normal again in our relationships. And now that America has elected Donald Trump twice, we're concerned that there is a volatility in American politics, that we're going to see this pendulum swing from kind of populist to populist. And that's why people are so focused on these midterms. And is this the moment of left-wing populism as well as right-wing populism in the country? And we don't know that America can be relied on. So you see that manifesting itself in Europeans spending more on their own defense, which I actually think is a great thing. I have been saying this for decades. I think President Trump on this is exactly right, that Europe needed to do more to protect itself. It can't just call 911 America every time it has a problem. That's not viable. So I think you're seeing that is the upside of this. The downside of this is that you have allies of the United States looking to other countries, particularly China, and to see whether they need to start having some other kind of trade, security, political, economic relationship with another superpower. I don't think this is to America's benefit in the long term, but I do think it's going to take more than just one election for European allies in particular to think, okay, that moment, that wild moment is over, we're back to normal. I think that's a hard sell for Europeans right now.
When you look at it long term, in the Republican Party, obviously President Trump has reshaped the party over the last decade or so. But where do you think the Republicans go post-Trump? What do you think the party looks like?
I mean, just as I said that the midterms are going to be a kind of reflection of where the Democratic Party is, I do think the midterms are also going to be some reflection of, and this is the big question we all have, is this the era of Trump or is this the era of Trumpism? So will the next Republican candidate and Republican president look and feel and sound like Donald Trump? I mean, I think stylistically that's very difficult. I do think he is a kind of one-off. All of his years in entertainment, just his personality are unlike any of the other Republican candidates we see. But do they continue the protectionist policies, the more isolationist policies, this reordering of the way that America uses power around the world with kind of interventions that aren't necessarily to America's benefit and perhaps not to other countries' benefit as well? So I think that is going to be interesting to watch. Can the Republican Party resume some of its old mannerisms and policies, and is it going to be more standing up for free trade? Are we going to see a reinstitution of that firewall that I mentioned between the Department of Justice and the White House? Or are we going to have whoever it is that comes in as the next president, Republican, perhaps even a Democrat, say, okay, we've seen an expansion of executive power. We've seen what Donald Trump has managed to do with executive orders, how he has cast his kind of influence over the agencies of government. And I would be a mug not to do that too. I mean, what president doesn't want more power? They're not known for having small egos, Danny. But I think that'll be interesting to see whether it's not just, who it is that replaces him. And is this the era of Trumpism? I think in 2028, Donald Trump he has an enormous war chest. He will have an enormous amount of power. And he's just shown that over the last few weeks in these primary campaigns and in Indiana. He will have an enormous amount of power over his successor. Then the question is going to be, how does that successor govern? I don't know that anyone of the potential candidates will have the same kind of hold over the party that Donald Trump has managed to have. I just don't know that they have the personality to do that.
Just the last question I'll ask you before I let you go is when you kind of look at 2026, and obviously every state, every individual federal election is different, but what do you think are going to be the top maybe 2 or 3 defining issues that are going to define the midterms?
I think it's going to be clearly economics, right? I mean, it always is in elections, not just in America, but around the world. People are focused on their own economic issues. And right now that means inflation. And let's see where we are with gas prices, but gas prices would be a manifestation of that. So I think inflation will be the number one issue. Immigration, interestingly, has slipped down a little bit, largely because the southern border has been shut. But I think if we start seeing more of these protests around detention centers and people still focused on what has happened to people who have been detained and who is being detained and the conditions under which they are being detained, I do think that could be an issue as well. And then I think actually, interestingly, the sleeper issue of the campaign is going to be data centers and America's dissatisfaction with AI. And the manifestation of that is those data centers. I saw a poll recently showing that AI is less popular than ICE is in America right now, where you have to be doing a pretty good job, bad job maybe, to be less popular than ICE. But AI is that. And I think you're going to start seeing objection to data centers and to AI taking jobs.
I think you're onto something with the data centers, because talking with even people in rural Minnesota, right and left, it's almost a uniting issue with some of the opposition that we've seen.
Such a uniting issue. I mean, the detention centers, no, that's much more of a Democratic issue. But I spend a lot of time in Virginia as well. I go out there most weekends, and we have a ton of data centers in Northern Virginia. And I'm seeing yard signs against data centers next to yard signs for President Trump. So this is not, you're right, you're quite right. This is not a left-right issue. This is one of the few issues about which Americans are united at the moment politically.
Well, Katty, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in Minneapolis in October with Anthony Scaramucci and your The Rest is Politics U.S. tour coming up this fall. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching another episode of KARE 11 on the Record. Remember, you can catch us every Sunday morning at 6:30 a.m. on KARE 11 and streaming all day on KARE 11 Plus.